All right, shall we start? It's 5 o'clock. All right, welcome everyone. Happy to see so many of you at our second book presentation of this year. Today we're going to put the focus on Amy Golahny's Rembrandt studies in his varied approaches to Italian art, published by Brill. On the program are the author herself and two referents of the book, Erik Jan Sluijter and Jeroen Giltaij. Before introducing Amy, I would like to thank Brill and especially Ivo Romein for his support, as well as Sandrine de Jong and Antina Hartman of Leiden University. A big thank you to all of you. I put on the PowerPoint of Amy. Yes, there you go. And a very quick introduction. Amy Golahny is Richmond Professor Emerita at Leiden College and past president of the HMA, the Historians of Netherlandish Art. She has published extensively on Pieter Lastman, Rembrandt, and other topics. And today we'll talk about her latest book. Amy, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stijn, Jeroen, and Erik Jan.
Before you start, Jeroen and Erik, can you put out your sound? Otherwise, there's sometimes a strange echo.
I don't know how do I do that?
Oh, if you go to the
left,
upper left.
Oh yeah, you see the mic.
Yes, and if you just put on that, click on that. Yes, you did well. All right, Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for coming. I wish we were not so virtual, but we're still here. The topic of exchange between Italy and Northern Europe is one with which I've long been interested, and my exposure to Rembrandt began early. As a child, I was fortunate to frequent museums, as did many who have become art historians, for which we credit our families very often. My exposure to Rembrandt came early with memorable Rembrandt exhibitions in 1969 in Boston, Detroit, Chicago, and Minneapolis. Of course, 1969 was an anniversary year, and we've had many since. I had no idea then that Dutch art might appeal to me at all. My serious engagement with art history began with the Tuscan Trecento, moved into the Quattrocento, and finally the Cinquecento. Grad school seminars were on Dürer, Rubens, and Titian, and only finally on Rembrandt with John Walsh and Egbert Haverkamp-Bergman. My search for a dissertation topic ended when Egbert suggested Rembrandt and Venice, and through many circuitous routes, the present book has its inception then. The topic, Rembrandt's approach to Italian art and culture, is a grander one than encompassed in this book, and I've no doubt that future studies will examine it from other angles. Rembrandt's constant experimentation is fundamental to his creative method. He experimented with materials, application of paint, narrative, and invention. His from-life ideology, as articulated by Perry Chapman and Erik Jan, is also fundamental. The Bathsheba of 1643 demonstrates how he combined the illusion of live flesh with his familiarity with Raphael. In adapting and altering figures from Raphael prints, Rembrandt was following current practice. Cornelis van Haarlem inserted a quotation from Raphael at the very center of his flagrant display of muscle men in the Massacre of the Innocents. He adjusted the pose of the soldier, however, who pursues a mother, to make their encounter more forceful. The soldier grasps the mother's shoulder rather than the baby's foot. To heighten the violence of the scene, Cornelis included 3 mothers attacking a soldier. In this way, he considered how he could improve upon Raphael's invention of the same subject. The naturalism of Rembrandt's art fascinated his contemporaries and circulated throughout Europe in Stefano della Bella's drawing books. This particularization offered contrast to the smoothed ideal. Sandrart regarded this naturalism in opposition to graceful and repeatable figures, and he considered Rembrandt ignorant of antiquity, histories, language, perspective, and proportion, all of which were well studied by Rembrandt. His knowledge of Roman literature and current art is demonstrated by his early mythologies. His combination of Diana and Actaeon with Callisto has often been regarded as unique. But Rembrandt may have been very well informed of artistic events in Rome and heard of the temporary exhibition in Santa Maria de Constantini. Among the 12 paintings by foremost Roman artists was Lanfranco's canvas that combined Diana, Callisto, and Actaeon. This possible precedent for Rembrandt's combination of the two Diana episodes has been recently discussed by Stephanie Dickey. Both Lanfranco and Rembrandt would have considered Titian's Poesia for Philip II as their competitive challenge. What seems unique or highly unusual in Rembrandt's art often has some precedent or parallel in the work of others. In portraiture, Rembrandt could be conventional or radical. With The Shipbuilder, he created a domestic drama. I suggest that this grand double portrait was prompted by the urgent communication of Guercino's Semiramis, then in Amsterdam. Rembrandt did not need to travel beyond Holland to see major paintings and prints by Italian artists. He stated to Constantijn Huygens in 1629 that he had already studied much Italian art and was familiar with the inconvenience of traveling south. His earliest paintings are evidence that he studied Giorgione, Raphael, and Titian, as well as Rubens and Dürer. Such references to other artworks take on meaning only if they are given interpretations that make sense within Rembrandt's oeuvre. At the core, he identified with illustrious northern predecessors and paid them homage with his references. He turned to the Italians only when it was convenient, and when it was convenient to exploit their inventions or to improve upon them. So we have him looking at Dürer for homage and looking at the Italians for competition and commentary. Among his most direct references are figures lifted from Dürer and Martin van Heemskerk. From Dürer's etching, he took line for line the figure of Christ in the expulsion of the money changers, here shown in reverse. From Heemskerk's woodcut, he closely followed the contours of the angel, as in the angel departing from Tobias and his family, but in reverse. And this angel would appear often in the workshop, as in Flink's painting of Manoah. Examples from northern artists were teaching tools in the workshop, but Italian examples seem not to have figured in instruction. In the Homer of 1662, Rembrandt combined figures from Titian and Van Dyck to arrive at a synthesis of the stolid d'Armagnac from Titian and the spontaneous Mainwaring from Van Dyck. These double portraits were not known in print, but there were many painted copies of both of them. Even as Van Dyck looked to Titian, Rembrandt looked to both. His knowledge of art was profound. He possessed a quantity of large plasters after ancient and modern sculpture. He was familiar with the non-canonical pieces of ancient art. The so-called Capitoline Sibyl did not appear in print. Presumably, Rembrandt would have known it in a plaster copy for the three musicians, for the turbaned figure And here, this is a comparison first brought into the literature by Martha Gyllenhaal. Perrier's albums after ancient sculptures and reliefs were available to Rembrandt shortly after they were published, and he made use of the print after the Psyche relief for Bathsheba. His collection of paper art was remarkable in quality and quantity, and included multiple prints, for example, after Leonardo's Last Supper. A few drawn copies after Titian landscapes indicate that he must have been familiar with others. The fantastic horse leaping out of a lake with a serpent was copied in Rembrandt's workshop, or possibly by Rembrandt. Another drawing of a bear eating a goat was copied by Rembrandt and later by Watteau. But other drawings indicate there were probably others known to him, as in this drawing of a house in a landscape that might indicate the sort of sheet he would have been familiar with. The term gagliarda is used to describe Rembrandt's painting as forceful and shadowed in the Ruffo correspondence by Abraham Bruegel, Guercino, and Brandi. When Ruffo sought pendants from these four Italian artists, he apparently sent them a drawing of the Aristotle without identifying it, and of course, Ruffo himself wasn't sure what was represented in the Aristotle. Guercino thought it a physiognomist and made a cosmographer. Preti may have been aware of the Homer instructing two pupils and made Dionysius of Syracusa as a schoolmaster. Presumably familiar with the Aristotle in some form, Brandi later painted a nude for Ruffo as a gift of a nude artist painting a canvas of Titius and the Vulture, now lost, and sort of approximated in part by Ribera's Titius. In this now lost picture, Brandi combined sight and touch, probably thinking that the Aristotle was about touch, as a man resting his hand on a sculpture. Gagliarda, as defined by Baldinucci, indicated figures emerging from heavy shadows. Bellori applied the term to Caravaggio, with specific reference to St. Catherine in the Wheel and later Caravaggio paintings. Even though Bruegel resented Ruffo's obsession with Rembrandt and disparaged his dark shadows, he also admitted that the Ruffo Rembrandts were incomparable to anything in Italy. Perhaps he wished to flatter Ruffo as a patron, but he also wished to place works by his friends in the Messina gallery. Ruffo, successful in obtaining the Aristotle, Homer, and Alexander, would have acquired more paintings if Rembrandt were willing to send him sketches. Cosimo de' Medici was turned away from Rembrandt's door, and Francesco Sauli was perhaps successful in obtaining a modello, now lost, but not more. And had Sauli fulfilled the plan he seems to have had in mind, there would be one or two large, late Rembrandt altarpieces in the crossing of the church at Carignano. Rembrandt repeatedly had disputes with his Dutch patrons, as has often been pointed out, and most recently by Paul Crenshaw, but his disputes with the Italians reveal his extreme unwillingness to satisfy their expectations. He was thorny, proud, and stubborn. He asserted his artistic position by delay, financial demands, and non-delivery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. also for the beautiful illustrations you use to make your point so vividly. I put on the PowerPoint of Erik Jan Sluijter. There we go. Erik Jan Sluijter is, of course, one of the top experts here in this field. He's professor of art history of the Renaissance and early modern period, emeritus since April 2011. Professor Sluijter has published widely on many aspects of Dutch painting and printmaking in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, from 16th century prints to 18th century painted wall hangings, and of course also his work on Brill and Rembrandt. I'm very, very happy to give you the floor. Thank you very much for being here, Professor Sluijter.
Well, thank you for your kind words, Stijn. It's a great pleasure to say a few things about Amy Golahny's book. Congratulated, Amy. It's a wonderful book, and I read it with admiration. Amy's book underlines the paradox that, on the one hand, Rembrandt was on many different levels intensely involved with Italian art, but on the other, that he was always considered as an artist whose art and ideas represented an antithesis to the Italian example. Amy poses that problem in the beginning of chapter 2, asking what it means that Rembrandt's art was regarded by his contemporaries as antithetical to the values associated with antiquity and the Italian Renaissance, while his expertise of that art was so wide and deep. And this is a fascinating question, I think, that, as I see it, runs as a strong undercurrent through the whole book, which makes reading the book a thought-provoking experience. Rembrandt's involvement with Italian art and antiquity makes us continually wonder how his contemporaries would have viewed his complex relationship to this art. In the preface, the author writes, and I quote, "Rembrandt plunders art as he found it useful and worth his commentary. By tracing the contribution of the Italian tradition, we may further contextualize Rembrandt within the general development of European art," end quote. And it was a brilliant idea to tackle Rembrandt's plundering of Italian art via 3 categories. First, pragmatic adaptation, so Rembrandt understanding how simple appropriation leads to greater visual power. Secondly, appropriation as critical commentary, that is, referencing exemplary artists in order to demonstrate his superiority. And thirdly, conceptual rivalry, which means emulating illustrious artists to find alternatives, to arrive at unique formulations. The author's discussion of examples of these 3 categories in chapter 4, 5, and 6 constitute the core of the book and demonstrate not only how ingeniously and deliberately Rembrandt probed the possibilities of Italian works of art, but also how familiar he was with manifold aspects of that art. Therefore, it's very opportune to begin the book with a chapter 1, in which he discusses why Rembrandt did not go to Italy and what he would have known about Italian art and ideas, and in which he examines the tradition of the Italian sojourn, the role of the Italian experience of his 2 masters, the presence of Italian art in Amsterdam collections, and, of course, Rembrandt's own fabulous collection. That chapter should not be skipped by the reader. Though the author allows this, I think that even those familiar with Dutch artists in Italy and the art market in Amsterdam should not do that, because it's a valuable preparation to the following chapters. Not only 4, 5, and 6, but also to chapter 2 and 3. In chapter 3, we find again a very enlightening categorization, the distinction between Rembrandt's different types of views of his collection. First, copies of figures and compositions, so where Rembrandt had the prototype right before his eyes in drawing or prints, but in which he always edited certain elements. Secondly, his application of motifs, figures, or compositions recalled from memory, freely adopting and adapting aspects of the original. And thirdly, recollected motifs from art when he was drawing from life or from the imagination. But as food for discussion, I would like to consider more closely questions raised by chapters 7 and 2. Chapters that are the cornerstones of the book and which make especially explicit the paradox I was talking about in the beginning, that Rembrandt was deeply involved with the example of antiquity and Italian art, and the fact that he was seen as antagonistic to it. Chapter 7 enables us to examine this within the discussion of divergent styles, and Amy talked already about this. It was a great idea to extensively pay attention to the responses of Guercino, Mattia Preti, Salvatore Rosa, and Giacinto Brandi, whom Antonio Ruffo deliberately pitted against Rembrandt by requesting them to make a painting meant to hang next to Rembrandt's works. Preti and Rosa, as Amy also said, did this with reluctance, obviously resenting Ruffo's high admiration for the foreigners. Oh dear. Shit. Guercino was very serious about it and wrote with obvious reference about Rembrandt as a great virtuoso, and agreed to accommodate his style and to paint in his prima maniera gagliarda. Amy talked already about that too, meaning a manner with deep shadows and bright light, with appropriate halftones, dynamic figures forcefully emerging from the shadows in full relief, and with naturalness, una maniera forte e rilevata, associated with, in particular, Tintoretto, Bassano, Caravaggi, and Guercino, in his early manner. Also, Brandi's reaction is extremely interesting. He writes that if he had known that his painting was to hang alongside Rembrandt's work, he would have made it di maniera gagliarda and given it l'ultima sforza, utmost force, kracht, which means forcefully coming forward. In an instructive discussion of the maniera gagliarda, Amy shows that this was clearly the category in which Rembrandt was situated by the Italians. But there were doubts if a Dutchman could do more than making dressed half figures in still situations. As a matter of fact, Brandi subsequently made a second painting, also mentioned already, choosing the rather weird subject of a painter, probably a self-portrait, with nude upper body, working on a painting of Titius, whose liver is devoured by a vulture. Brandi literally writes that he made this painting in competition with the Dutch master. And allow me a short digression to say that I'm convinced that Brandi must have chosen this unusual subject because of the oft-repeated Italian cliché that northern painters were not good in painting figures, let alone nude figures expressing violent emotions. And Titius was the subject that was preeminently fit to show off one's capacities in this field. Brandi would have thought that that was where Italians could surpass this northerner, not knowing, of course, that Rembrandt had made a masterpiece by reacting in a true conceptual rivalry precisely to the famous Titius compositions by Michelangelo, Titian, and Ribera, and, of course, Rubens's Prometheus and Caravaggio's late Judith and Holofernes. We do not know what Brandi's painting looked like, but the subject was certainly popular among his contemporary colleagues, working in what we could call the maniera gagliarda. So far this digression just as an extra for fun, but back to the subject of discussion now. This chapter, chapter 7, makes abundantly clear how painters, as well as connoisseurs, were highly conscious about stylistic choices and the different effects of style. And Guercino's words, written down by Scanelli, that he had changed his style to satisfy the taste of the majority, and above all of those who paid for the works they ordered, imply that as a painter, Guercino preferred the maniera gagliarda. This acute awareness of style and admiration for the maniera gagliarda we also find with Joachim von Sandrart, which brings me to chapter 2, where Sandart's criticism of Rembrandt is discussed. I'm afraid I have to dispute the contention that Sandrart had an inflexible understanding of antiquity and Italian Renaissance art as constituting the absolute norm. On the contrary, not only did Sandrart himself work in very different styles, first in Rome in an updated Hunter style, then in Amsterdam, as far removed as possible from Rembrandt style, mixing his Roman knowledge of artists like the early Poussin, Domenichino, and Pietro da Cortona, and went back in Germany, especially in his late altarpieces, in a style that we could call, in a way, maniera gagliarda. In his biography, Sandrart describes with great admiration artists like Caravaggio, Valentin de Boulogne, Manfredi, and Ribera, for whom he is full of praise, not a negative word about their art. Most interesting is, for example, his discussion of the two altarpieces by Valentin and Poussin, St. Peter in Rome, telling it was much disputed which one was the best, which one was the best, but asserting that they both had their own superb qualities. Poussin especially in invention, passions, and affects, and Valentin in true naturalness, force, erhebung, coming forward, and harmony of colors. Truthful naturalness only from life, forceful coming forward through light and dark, natural colors, overall harmony. These are the terms Sandrart uses for Valentin, Caravaggio, or Manfredi, and also when writing about Rembrandt's manner. The difference being that he employs them in Rembrandt's biography with even greater care to indicate Rembrandt's mastery in maintaining an overall harmony, enhancing the effect as a whole. Nowhere in his book does Sandrart, in fact, describe so extensively and with so much precision the style of a painter as in Rembrandt's case, and he does this with sincere admiration. But indeed, he did deny Rembrandt's knowledge of antiquity and Italian art, and he is very negative about Rembrandt as a painter who could barely make use of literature, could not deal with patrons, moved in circles of low-born people, and flouted the rules of human proportions and perspectives, and the usefulness of antique statues or the drawings of Reuben. But you should realize that it's not Rembrandt's style he has problems with. On the contrary, or not even his ideas about painting. What he does censure is Rembrandt's attitude as a painter. And he had specific reasons for this. Sandrart saw himself, and he indeed was, as the chic cosmopolitan and erudite artist who had studied in Prague, in London, in Venice, Florence, and Rome, who had served Vincenzo Giustiniani, who knew Rubens personally, who was friends with Poussin, Pietro da Cortona, Duquesnoy, and who owned and who moved in the highest circles of the ruling and intellectual elite when working in Amsterdam between 1637 and 1645. And then there was this man, Rembrandt, a man he couldn't figure out, who was different in every respect, but who was also his greatest rival, greatly admired and asking staggering prices Sandrart could only dream of. Therefore, Sandrart made the contrast with his own position artistically as well as socially as sharp as possible, exaggerating everything that an elite would find objectionable. also playing along with the commonplace about the failure of Dutch artists to depict history properly. But he did see how great the painter Rembrandt was. And I, in contrast, do think that Sandaert, who was extremely well versed in antiquity and Renaissance art, and who described himself with the simile of the honeybee taking honey from many different flowers, die begierigen Kunstbiene, he calls himself, that Sandaert must have seen how Rembrandt handled figures and motifs from antiquity and Renaissance art, and that he did see that Rembrandt had studied them intensely. And that would have annoyed Sandaert even more, I think. Perhaps we may say in general that precisely the fact that it must have been obvious to artists and connoisseurs that Rembrandt was on the one hand very knowledgeable about and intensely in dialogue with antiquity and Italians, but on the other hand had seemed to transform such sources without the respect and awe that was expected, and that he even considered himself superior, in great contrast to Rubens, for example, that it was this that caused the often vehement reactions to see him as antithetic and anomalous. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik Jan, for this very interesting contribution. We will, of course, go to Amy to respond, but I will just first listen to Jeroen. Jeroen, Giltaij, can you put on your mic and your microphone? So your mic and your camera, I mean. So we're sure that can you?
How do I?
There you are. You can put on your camera by next to the.
Oh yes, I see.
Where you put on the mic. Yes, there you are. Let me see if I can see you. No, not yet. Let me see.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, it's still gray. We hear you, that's for sure, but we cannot see you. Hear you, that's of course the most important thing, but it would
the camera, right?
to have a face. Strange because we could see you at the start of the presentation.
I don't see.
No, it's strange. Let's do it without. Yes, there you are. Great.
I didn't do anything. Okay.
Now I can introduce you. Jeroen Giltaij is former senior curator of old master paintings, Museum Boijmans van Beuningen. He has published widely on Dutch visual arts in the 17th century, among others on Jan de Brij, Sanerdam, and Rembrandt. Actually, I just used this week your book on perspectives and Sanerdam, so in that way it is still on the top of my list of reading. Very happy to have you here. The floor is yours to give a review of Amy's book.
Yes. Well, maybe I start with telling something about myself, how I get involved in this program, because it was in 1990, a long time ago, that I was intrigued by the Principe Antonio Ruffo della Foresta della Bagnara in Messina, who ordered this painting by Rembrandt in 1652. Aristotle with the bust of Homer. The subject became, in 1997, my dissertation. So for Professor Ilja Veldman at the Free University in Amsterdam. The many letters from the artist to Antonio Ruffo were already published by Vincenzo Ruffo in 1916 and 1919, the family then. But no one had ever seen in reality these letters. So it was even thought that they were lost. So Mary Garrett, in a book on the monograph on Artemisia Gentileschi from 1989, said they didn't exist anymore. Oh, wow, what happened? Yes. But I took the phone book of Sicily and I started calling all the Ruffos I could find. And the third evening, I had somebody said, yes, in Italian, of course, we have the letters. So I went to Sicily, to San Giorgio, and I was received there by Paolo Matricardi, and I got a huge book of all the letters, which was great, of course, with the letter of Rembrandt in it, and also with the documents about the transportation. So it was separate documents. Later, I went back to Sicily because I was also interested in the archives of the family, and they were in the cellar of another family member, Don Fabrizio Ruffo. So I had to go back and studied meters of paper to find the inventories, so which I found then. So it was a very interesting subject, I think. For me, were very important questions were who was this Antonio Ruffo, and how did his collection look like, and so on. And I tried to see what paintings still exist of that collection, and there were only 15, which is from the 364, which is not very much, of course, but they were all very important, very interesting paintings. Then, so I followed the whole transactions and the notes, the bills, the transportation, and some descriptions of the painting. And I found out that Alexander the Great, so he first started with Aristotle, then the second was Alexander the Great together with the Homer, but Alexander the Great was lost, which I could decide about because of the inventories. It didn't exist anymore around 1800, so it must have been gone somehow. Then I've studied also the other paintings which were ordered by Antonio Ruffo for a very curious series, because a series which started with the Aristotle and then had these paintings by Guercino and Giacinto Brandi, so different sizes, different subjects. So it must have been a very curious series of paintings, I think. And I was very happy because the painting by Salvatore Rosa was so far not discovered, but in Amy's book I saw that it was discovered in the Prado. Also very interesting painting, but a small painting, much smaller than the others, than the big ones by Rembrandt. Later, after my dissertation, were published the documents by Lauro Magnani of the commission of which was shown Francesco Maria Salvi from Genova in 1666 for paintings, and other paintings were studied by Jaco Rutgers for his dissertation in 2008, a wonderful dissertation, I think. But now we have Amy's book, and Ruffo, my Ruffo, is only one chapter in it, but an important chapter, I think. I think, Amy, it's a wonderful book. It's written so well. I mean, you read it like a novel, really. And for example, the last sentence in the book is, "The Rembrandt moment was over. For Abraham Bruegel, its demise could not have come soon enough." Well, it's beautiful, I think. Amy made an impressive study of all kinds of the relationships of Rembrandt and Italian art, starting with his teachers, his critics, his collection. About his books, you published in 2003 already, this book. His borrowings for paintings, his dealing with Italian painters, and finally, how the Italians looked at his art as far as they knew it. Because, how much did they knew in Italy about Rembrandt? And that's still a question, I think. It's an immense subject, and it throws light on the most interesting aspect of Rembrandt's art, his relation to Italian art. I had not realized that this relation was so intense, and it has wonderful passages. For example, about the painting now in the Royal Collection with the shipbuilder and his wife. Erik Jan showed this beautiful painting, 1633, which Amy compares with portraits of Thomas de Keyser, Sebastiano del Piombo, and Guercino, the painting possibly in the Reinst collection. and ends with the sentence, Rembrandt's radical solution to a Marriott's portrait in The Shipbuilder is unique for gender reversal and dramatic speech. Again, a beautiful end of a chapter. But I was asked to give comment, and there are also remarks to be made, I think, because I found suppositions and conclusions about which I was wondering. First, for example, Amy says, Rembrandt's art was regarded by Guercino as ponderous, dark, and presumably unfashionable, as discussed in chapter 7. This is on page 71. I'm not so sure if that's right, because in the letter of Guercino from June 13, 1660 to Ruffo, he mentioned Rembrandt as a gran virtuoso. And I think he must have seen it as an honor being asked for this companion piece, must have admired it, and was even willing to adapt his style for it, although he had never seen a painting by Rembrandt in reality. He only knew, he describes him from the prints and from hearsay. So I'm not so sure that Rembrandt was regarded Guercino as ponderous, dark, and unfashionable. Unfashionable, okay, but second, on page 71, unfashionable. Unfashionable, okay, but second, on page 71, Italian art and ideas contributed to Rembrandt's inventions, but these did not determine his approach, Amy writes. I think Rembrandt's late style was determined for a great part by Titian's late style. I think Jonathan Dicker just wrote a whole article about that in the latest Rembrandt catalogue in the Rijksmuseum. And that Italian art was not only important for his inventions, but also really determining for his style. He took it as an example and wanted to surpass Titian, of course, wanted to be better than Titian. So I think his approach was determined also by Titian. Third, it was found very ingenious, but for me may be going too far to suppose that Rembrandt was inspired for the so-called column in his 1628 Supper at Emmaus, the painting in Paris, by a copy by Louis Vincent after the Madonna of the Rosary by Caravaggio from 1607. When you study this very small, great painting, early painting, 1627, 1628, dated, you see on the back a bag hanging on the wall. So, and it's put on with a big nail. So I think there's no column there. I think it's a wooden fence or something, and a nail is put in and the bag has hung on it. I don't see the column. So, and if it is a column, then there are also columns in Lastman paintings, for example. There are lots of columns in Lastman paintings. So I don't think he needed the column of Caravaggio. 4. On page 133, you reproduce the Rembrandt drawing in Stockholm with a Homer, and you call it a preparatory drawing. So a drawing made by Rembrandt to prepare his composition. But the drawing was in 1760, 1770, in the 18th century, was bought in Rome by the Swedish sculptor Sergel. And so it came in the Stockholm collection. Ruffo had asked Rembrandt to send him sketches, and I thought the Stockholm drawing could be that sketch, which he had sent to Messina, and then when the whole Ruffo collection was split up, it came in the 18th century and for sale in Rome. That's what I think. So, in my view, it's not a preparatory drawing, but a vidimus, which you call it, to show what to Rembrandt's idea the composition could be. And he drawn in already the bow on the upper side, and there was also in the painting there was originally a bow. So he gave an idea of the original composition he had in mind. By the way, this is something different. And Sluijter makes a vertical reconstruction of the painting of Homer in the Mauritshuis, but I think that's not right. I mean, the drawing is horizontal, and I think it had, because the reconstruction is a very curious painting. Well, okay, but that's something else. Then it's said of the painting on page 142 from 1626 in Moscow, Christ driving the money changers from the temple, that Rembrandt gave the features of the face of Titian to the chief banker in the painting, who grabs the coins. So you see a very ugly face in the painting by Rembrandt. He's grabbing the coins, and that's his example was then, according to Amy, the face of Titian. Well, that's I'm very reluctant to see that, because for me there are two, but it's so wonderful that Amy thinks those things. I mean, it's wonderful that it's so original to think of that and to propose it, and you start thinking and you're reading with great pleasure. But I don't think I agree. On page 156, it said that Rembrandt took for his Pharisee, in the 100 guilder print, the figure of Judas from Leonardo. And yeah, that's on figure 1898. And in my view, that seems to be very speculative, because are these Judases really comparable? I mean, there's a nice guy in Rembrandt's etching, sitting, chatting, and then there's this horrible Judas sitting next to Christ in Leonardo's painting. So if there is something to compare, I'm not so sure. Then my last one is page 182, that it's very ingenious again, I think, that Amy said that Rembrandt transformed the Psyche in the print of François Perrier from 1645, which is figure 120, into the nude of Bathsheba in the Louvre from 1654, and the seated girl in the print into the kneeling woman. When you see it at first time, you think, well, it's very convincing, but then it can also be that it's a kind of coincidence that François Perrier made a print and made a classical figure and a young girl doing the foot of Psyche, and that some years later, Rembrandt made a completely different kind of thing and made the Bathsheba. I mean, the connection between the two is a great idea again, but I think, yeah, I was not completely convinced. So that Rembrandt had a profound exchange with Italian art is made clear, but sometimes the comparisons seem, for me, a little speculative. Some remarks then from me on a most interesting books, and I want to congratulate Amy with this beautiful result. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jeroen, for this thorough analysis and review. Amy, I give you the floor just to answer. Maybe not all the
remarks, no,
questions and remarks, but maybe more generally. Sandrart, what Erik Jan turned up, and then of course some of those correspondences. Of course, the rest of the viewers here today are more than welcome to put their questions in the chat. We come back to that too. But Amy, the floor is yours first.
Thank you. Thank you, Erik Jan and Jeroen, for your incredibly insightful comments. If I had all the time in the world, would go back and rewrite my book according to your observations. I'm extremely glad that we can now look at Sandrart in a new light. Maybe he just didn't like Rembrandt's abrasive personality and didn't want to admit that he really respected his knowledge of antiquity, etc. And Jeroen, I'm very glad you're skeptical of some of those borrowings. I think they are worthy of skepticism. And now I have to go back and look at the Emmaus for the nail in the column, if
Yes,
it's a column.
right.
All right.
Are there chat questions?
Yes, there are. Jeffrey Mueller asks, how did Rubens' imitation of Italian art provide Rembrandt with a model for Rembrandt's imitation?
Of course it did, to some extent, because Rubens is one of those forces in Rembrandt's self-image and in many of his histories as a guiding force. So Rubens was the ultimate genteel scholar, artist, collector. And I think Rembrandt probably did have both Sandrart and Rubens as competitive models, but he wasn't going to admit it.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you can give an example where you can see that Rembrandt was using Rubens' inspiration from the Italians.
Well, he was using the Persephone, which is both inspiration from antiquity and literature. And from the Italians with Rubens, it's so pervasive. But the hero in Leander was in Rembrandt's house for 7 years, where Sandrart would have seen it, presumably, because Sandrart knew the picture at exactly that time. So it gets a little murky because Sandrart and Rembrandt had a lot of contact, and Rembrandt was looking at Rubens very seriously from the very beginning, from at least 1626 and probably earlier. I mean, his earliest work. The Stoning of St. Stephen is worth mentioning there. Rubens in Italy is such a pervasive topic, which we have had, recent literature certainly has covered it. So that's a great comment, Jeff. So thank you.
Other questions in the chat? Just waiting a bit because sometimes it takes some time to formulate those questions. But in the meantime, maybe I was interested by the remark of Jeroen in how far you can call Rembrandt fashionable or unfashionable in Italy. Maybe you could elaborate a bit on that, Amy.
I think there's a lot more to discover with Dutch artists in Italy, and recent work in inventories has helped that greatly.
Could I say something about that?
Yeah, sure.
I think that's a misunderstanding to consider Rembrandt as unfashionable for Italian eyes. And certainly for Ruffo and Sauli, the one in Genova, the other in Sicily, because it is, especially in the 1660s, there was a lot of maniera gagliarda in Italy. I only think of Luca Giordano. I mean, very dark, which has heavy contrast between light and dark, etc. So, and there were many artists, especially in Naples and Genova, but also in Venice, for example, in that period, and working in the Tenebroso style. Mm-hmm. So there was much more than we tend to think of when we think of Italian art of the 17th century. We always think of Rome. I mean, it's so focused on Rome, but there's so much going on in Italy at that period.
Thank you. Yes.
Other question from the chat from Ingrid Vermeulen. Through what artistic medium did Rembrandt best get to know Italian art according to you? Prints, drawings, plaster casts, paintings?
All of the above. But prints in particular, because they traveled, they were available, they were compact. The paintings that tended to go to Italy and travel, to go to Amsterdam and travel from Italy, typically would have been the smaller, more portable ones. But the Caravaggio Rosary Madonna is an exception in that respect. But there must have been many versions of a lot of pictures, including by the Bassano workshop, for example, that moved around, especially if they were on canvas and not so large. And the other problem with plasters is that they disintegrate and they can be easily damaged, so they don't survive. So all we have are effectively verbal records. And the marbles that tended to come to the north of Europe tended not to be whole figures or necessarily restored. So there's an awful lot of detective work still to be done to figure out what Rembrandt could have known.
A question by Harriet Rahusen. Do we know how those who did travel to Italy financed their trip? Was Rembrandt one of the unfortunate who did not have or receive funding?
When the Dutch artists went to Italy, they very often got some kind of job there. And they funded their travels with whatever job they could pick up, it would seem. But there are a lot of exceptions to that. We don't always know that they did work. We know that they sketched, for example, and some of those artists would have kept records, but most of them did not. Ter Borch is a good example of the diligent artist who spends a few years and goes back. But we don't really have a record of him earning money there. So that's a very good question, and it needs to be explored more. There are records of so many artisans who have Dutch names in Rome, and we have no idea really what they were doing or who they were, but there are recorded payments or records in some way of them.
All right. Barbara Heger refers to the Descent of the Cross as an example of the relationship with Reuben's Descent of the Cross altarpiece, engraved by Vosterman. It engages in dialogue with Rubens, she says.
There are many points where Rembrandt is having a dialogue with Rubens, and usually he goes in the direction of rough and humble, where Rubens was grand and elegant. That's pervasive, I think.
Yes. Yeah, that's a whole discussion, of course, in how far Rubens influenced it. So now that's a whole new book, or it is already a book that's several times written. So the whole influence by Rubens. All right. Oh, still one more question. I'm curious, but question by Yun Nakamura, about how much evidence there is of Rembrandt-looking Goltzius prints. Since a lot of Italian influences is filtered through Netherlandish prints. And of course, Jun himself works on the Goltzius prints, so he will be extra curious.
The answer is yes, a lot. Whatever happens from Van Mander's generation on, Goltzius and just about all the prints that Goltzius worked on might have been accessible to Rembrandt, and he would have recognized how they derived from various sources, Northerners as well as Southerners. The answer is yes.
And then a very last remark by Larry Silver. Is it worth recalling Castiglione's use of Rembrandt from Genoa, yes, especially in his sketched heads, but other works also?
I think so. I pointed that out, but there's more to be done, I think. Certainly, yes.
That's a very good ending. There's more work to be done. Always good. Leonora, congratulate you. I'm looking forward to be able to read the book. I think we all, who did not yet read the book, all look forward to reading it. Thank you all. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Erik Jan. Thank you, Jeroen. This was most inspiring. And also very interesting to hear, and also the remarks to take along. So thank you very much. Next book presentation is the book by Claudia Swan, Curiosities, edited by Princeton. You get all information on our website. Thank you very much, and hope to see you all live once after the whole Corona crisis is over. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stein.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.